To say this was double extortion, so ransomware and then exfiltration.
So we can't underscore enough the importance of MFA.
Be one of the largest data breaches of US health.
It was targeting the Snowflake's customers and stealing their data. We're not trying to be judgmental.
To back you up, speaking of impact, now worldwide 10,000 flights had to be cancelled. What would you say are the most important learning points to take into 2025? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Cyberkach Podcast. My name is Kachi and I'm your host on this podcast. We have back with us again Charles Onochie. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Yes, it's great to be back. Charles is the Vice President of Information Security or the Global CISO at GAN, manages a large team. So we're always happy to have you, Charles, because you have so much insight to give us. But today we're going to be going over the past year, which is 2024. There's been a lot of interesting and huge security events this year, Charles. Supply chain attacks, ransomware, news about disruption of ransomware platforms. There's been a lot that's happened this year. And what we want to do today, so our listeners can know, is go through a handful of what has happened this year and explore what we can take out as learnings from them, because from every major incident, we can take learnings, obviously. And Charles is here to give us at least a professional or a CISO's perspective of those learnings. So thank you once again for joining us, Charles. We can go right in, right?
Yeah, thanks, Kachi. It's I'm glad to be back, and let's roll.
Okay, so let's start with what was by some people billed to be the largest IT outage in history. It's a question, which was caused by CrowdStrike's faulty update. That's in July 2024. Now, what exactly happened? Now, CrowdStrike's Falcon platform, which is one of CrowdStrike's key platforms, they had an update that turned out badly for Microsoft because it's made several, at least 8.5 million Windows systems to have the blue screen of death. So this was a big deal, Charles. Finance, health, aviation, several different industries were affected. Some airlines had to shut down or suspend activities. So what happened? And it's interesting.
Yeah. I think some people have likened this to the feared Y2K bug. And even though we navigated through the Y2K bug, maybe for the younger viewers, they may not understand what the Y2K bug was. I remember then it seemed like it was going to be an apocalyptic thing. So I think the Y2K bug was more like the fear that switching from the last millennium to this millennium, that we were going to have a computer bug that was going to cause major platforms like computer systems to shut down, and that could affect different aspects of our lives. So I think this was more something in that nature, because we had like some critical services that were affected by this.
Aviation,
this bug.
Airlines had to just pause all their activities. Flights were not going in, nothing coming back, because their systems had just shut down and no one knew what was the issue. So it's a very, very interesting one, Charles.
Yeah, I don't want to sound... I like big tech, but I think this is one of the drawbacks of like having some like huge dominance of like single players in the industry, having very huge dominance, because what it means is that the sheer impact of their mistakes could be really huge, like we saw in this case of Microsoft and CrowdStrike.
Just to back you up, speaking of impact, now worldwide 10,000 flights had to be cancelled. So that's so many flights. And also, insurers estimate that the outage
sorry to cut you in, but when you hear that number, it just sounds like a number.
10,000. Yeah.
10,000 flights. But imagine the people who were going to be on those flights, the different reasons why they must have wanted to travel and were denied. Some of them could be life critical in that sense, right? So 10,000 flights.
That's a lot
So
of
that's
flights.
it's not 10,000 passengers. So that's a lot of, there could be have been businesses that, people needed to get on those flights to get, life-threatening surgery or something. You can begin to appreciate the real impact when you think of it, from that angle, right? That these are 10,000 flights with an average of, I don't know, maybe 100 passengers who needed to be somewhere to do something important. So you can see the scale.
Yes, definitely. And apart from the number of flights, just still speaking numbers. I mean, insurance estimated that it will cost at least the Fortune 500 companies $5.4 billion US dollars. That's another number that is not just a number. Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because you'll be like, why was this allowed to happen? I mean, nobody obviously said, let me shut down all the systems. But what obviously happened, or what did happen, was that the CrowdStrike platform regularly updates to get the latest threats to these Microsoft systems. Obviously, they provide services apart from Microsoft to other platforms, but those were not affected. And these updates are almost automated. So they just keep coming because the updates could happen multiple times a day. Yep. Now, one of them was faulty and it broke the systems that were affected. The 8.5 million Microsoft PCs and servers. And yes, the impact, still on the impact, it was so much of a big deal that shareholders and even Delta Airlines who were well hit had to take CrowdStrike to court, had to file a lawsuit at least. I need to confirm whether it was to CrowdStrike or Microsoft, but there were lawsuits obviously around that. So which is a big deal. But speaking of learnings, one of the things I had from my research had seen, the updates now are not just going to be automatically pushed. This is from CrowdStrike themselves. But it will be treated as regular code updates with internal testing and phased implementation. And the question is, why were they not doing it already? It has already happened, but this was one of their commitments afterwards. And also, customers that have these systems can choose their level of update adoption. So you want to be an early adopter of updates, should just come straight to you. General availability, or they can even opt out or delay updates.
Yeah, I think this underscores the importance of like good change management practices. So we always go back to the basics, because what you see is that
Charles loves the basics.
because the fundamentals, sometimes we get carried away by the hype and the of the crazy things and very good things as well that we see, but fundamentals, foundation is always important. Basic hygiene, basic best practices, is always good to adopt these. I know that it's easier said than done, because only someone who does not work in security would feel like these things as easy as it's said. But the truth is that when we have the good change management practices, a production system should be frozen, in the sense that every change to a production system must go through testing and approval. So because every change in the production system has a potential to change the state of operations, right? So we can look at this at two levels. So the first level is from the provider themselves, CrowdStrike. Now, for releasing these updates, I believe more testing could have been done. And I think we've adopted automated testing, which is fine, which is like fantastic, you get. But there's also the place of, after automated testing, it's also the place for manual testing. Someone should install that thing somewhere and just run through it. Okay, because in this case, if this update would have been deployed to all the different operating systems that were to receive this update, and someone manually checking what the impact is, we should have noticed the blue screen of death at that point.
Interesting. Yeah, it should have happened because now they say they'll be doing the internal testing.
Exactly. So then coming to the customers who got affected, right? Every production environment, right, especially when you're doing it at that scale, right, should have a staging or a QA environment or both.
They probably do. I mean, but it's just to find out why they definitely they would. They are huge
Because
organizations.
this
But to find out why they were not doing this testing.
yeah, I
All
would.
would
I'm
know.
just speaking generally.
Yes.
I'm not part of, and I don't have all the information from inside. But just looking at the whole process, so there are multiple points where this bug could have been
checkpoints.
detected, and building these points of check. So it's not just creating bureaucracies. I understand from a business perspective, reacting fast to the market, being able to push your product as fast as possible, you get. But these checkpoints are important, and they are also important for the business, right? So in the case of the end users, before pushing these updates to production, having a test environment, staging or QA, deploy that update there first. See what happens before you move it to production.
So the very, very basic best practices of change management.
Basic change management.
I completely agree, Charles. Especially when you consider the scale of the attack and how many systems worldwide were affected. But yep.
Yeah, I also understand, because I understand why this could have escaped as well. Okay, I'm speaking from the basics, right? From the theoretical basics. So let me speak from the practical side of how, things really work in a business setting, right? So now, most times you have these, especially like security updates, like signature updates, right? So these security updates, most times are not being treated as changes. So if you have like one version of, let's say you have security updates can be in two types. Let me put it this way, right? If my understanding is correct, this was an update to a sensor.
Yeah, sensor update.
Right. So it's not just a signature update. So these sensors are like agents that run within the kernel of the operating system. And for there to be an update to a sensor that runs in the kernel, you could already know that the impact could be dire.
It's a big deal.
Right. So it's not just pushing a new malware signature to a sensor that is already there. So the sensor is working and you just push new data for it to use in its detection. So those kind of updates, signature updates, we don't usually treat as changes because there's no change to the way that agent, which is doing the detection and all that, there's no change to how it works. But you're just sending it new data. It's just like updating a database that it references to check for, detection. So in that case, maybe that, but for a change to
at that level,
that affects an agent that runs within the kernel, I think that this should definitely be classified as a change. Right, so for many teams, it's possible that they've not separated these two kind of changes. So it's possible they treat these updates as security update, but a security update which just updates a signature database is different from a security update that updates a kernel running agent. So properly defining, what are what is a change within your environment and how those changes should be handled, you get, would have helped. And separating these two kind of changes would have probably helped.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I know we'll still talk about risk assessment later because you are very big on that. So we may reference this when we get to the risk assessment part. But the second one, the second major event that we want to look at was the Change Healthcare Ransomware. That was in February 2024, and Change Healthcare were hit by the Black Cat ransomware group. Well known. Now, again, maybe there are people that like to give these names, but this was said to be one of the largest data breaches of U.S. health and medical data in history, according to TechCrunch. But the thing is, first of all, Change Healthcare provides payments, revenue management, and other solutions to essentially the healthcare industry, mostly in the U.S. And this particular one, Charles, affected around the data of around 100 million people. Like 4 terabytes of data compromised. And actually, their parent company, United Health Group, had to pay a ransom of like 22 million USD. There was a lot that happened about the ransom. They may have had to pay again, but yeah, they had to pay a ransom. And what exactly happened? Stolen credentials used on one of their internal portals to enable remote access to their desktops. And these credentials were used because there was no multi-factor authentication. So maybe that's the key problem, no MFA. Yeah. And then after that, lateral movement and data exfiltration. Yeah.
So now I need to be very clear that when we're discussing this, we're not trying to be judgmental. Right?
I mean, it's a review.
We're just reviewing. You know what they said that, hindsight is 20/20. So when you're looking at things, in hindsight, you get a better vision. Mm-hmm. So we're not trying to, judge anyone. We're just trying to get the learnings from these incidents. And, these learnings would help us to better improve and, fortify our processes. So when you talk about a ransomware attack, there are multiple stages of ransomware attack, right? So the first stage is the access. So they found a
just to say, this was double extortion. So ransomware and then exfiltration.
Yes.
So double extortion.
Double extortion, right? So, and it's important to highlight that because that ups the ante when you're talking about the double extortion. So first of all, you gain entry into the environment. Let's say in this case, there was no MFA and they were able to gain entry into the environment. So we can't underscore enough the importance of MFA in this, today's, in today's computing environment. Now, there was initial access was established. There was lateral movement. So there are multiple points of detection. And this is also for our learning, right? So if there was no MFA, but they were, able to detect the lateral movement, something is going on.
Or the data exfiltration.
You get? Now, that's the big one. You get? That's the big one. The data exfiltration is the
4
big one.
terabytes.
Because we kind of monitor ingress traffic, like what is coming into our network. We want to see, monitor everything trying to communicate with our network. But much fewer people monitor egress traffic, what is going out of the network, right? So that point of data exfiltration, it's a good point to kill the chain. Because the way this works is that the data exfiltrated is going to be used eventually to blackmail you into paying. Because to mitigate a ransomware attack is quite easy. But to mitigate the blackmail, once data is exfiltrated, is more tricky. Because if you have like good backups, tested backups you can use that you can trust, you can call the bluff of the ransomware guys, because they have no data on you. You just clean your systems, restore from backups, and you're up and running. But once they've exfiltrated your data, now they have something to blackmail you about. So even though you have proper backups, which you can restore your operations from, your customer data is going to be exposed. So that blackmail is the joker that, the attackers play. And if we are able to have detection in place, right, to detect data exfiltration and kill it at that point, it makes the impact of the attack much more contained. Because when we're talking about insecurity, we're trying to either reduce the impact or we reduce the chances of that happening. So there are multiple points that we as security professionals could have been able to stop those attacks. But in this case, and it's also for our learning, all those checkpoints fell through. I'm sure for a lot of we see ransomware attacks, on the rise, and it's not like anyone is foolproof, because we're always playing the catch up. But it's also for our learning. For one, set up multi-factor authentication as much as possible. Two, try to build capabilities to detect anomalies within your network. Then third, try to detect data exfiltration. That is very important. And fourth, we also have ways of detecting data encryption when it's happening within the network. There are tools that are able to detect those. So I think these are important checkpoints and controls to build into our environments to help us to reduce the possibility
of these attacks.
There's no 100% guarantee, but these are points to look
reduce
at.
The likelihood.
Reduce the likelihood, yes.
I mean, these are very good thoughts, to be honest, especially that on data exfiltration. Let's look at another one, the third one this time around, and this was Snowflake. Snowflake customers, some of the customers were breached. First of all, Snowflake is a multi-cloud data warehousing platform, and they have several different customers. And what happened, Charles, was that first of all, Snowflake was not the one that was breached. It was some of their customers that are using their platform that were breached. So the affected customers had their credentials or some of their credentials stolen in another info stealer campaign, so credential theft campaign. Now, those people who had their Snowflake credentials compromised, some of them did not have MFA. Again, did not have maybe MFA set up on their platforms, and because of that, their accounts or their systems on Snowflake were breached. Now, obviously, Snowflake's name was being mentioned because they're a huge platform, and several of their customers were repeatedly being breached using this methodology of stealing credentials and then using it on the Snowflake platform. Some of the bigger profile organizations that were hit in this was like Spain, Santander Bank, with 30 million customer data compromised, 28 million credit card numbers, and even AT&T. So this was the Snowflake breach, but similar story again. No MFA.
Yeah. So
Snowflake customers breach.
Yeah. So Kachi, I think I won't say this enough. Back to basics. And if you read that incident, some of the accounts were breached as early as 2020. Some of the accounts were stolen, as early as 2020. And going back to basics. These days we have new guidance, right, about password age, like changing passwords, right? So these days the guidance is that choose a strong password and implement MFA. You don't have to change passwords every 90 days or every 180 days. The chances, right, that your password will be written down somewhere. If you have to change that often, is much higher. You get. So we understand that guidance, which I also encourage. But in a situation where MFA is not properly
Set up.
then back to basics means that an account in 2020, a password in 2020 should have been changed if there was no MFA, at least. Because it's not like now there's new guidance, so it's completely unnecessary. The reason why the guidance has changed is because we have better ways of, protecting accounts, which is like having more factor authentication. In the old days where, 2FA was not really a big deal, the guidance was change your password regularly, every 90 days or every 180 days, right? But now we have better ways of protecting accounts and credentials by introducing additional factors, which means that, the guidance to change password regularly is no longer needed. But not introducing MFA and not having to change your password over time, even though it's once a year. If some of those passwords had been changed once every year, some of the older ones would not be valid by the time of the attack, right? So we can see that it's still coming back to basics and how basic security principles or best practices can help us to mitigate these attacks. I think we've talked a lot about, the importance of MFA, and we cannot overflog it enough, right? It helps a lot when it comes to account, compromise.
Let's stay on MFA.
Okay.
Sorry to cut you short, because I want to quickly put in another question. So we've seen at least 2 instances now, top cyber events of this year, that were allowed to materialize because MFA not set up.
Yeah.
And just for some context for our listeners, MFA is multi-factor authentication, which is essentially multi-step login process that requires more than just passwords. So maybe your token, how is it said? Something you have, something you are, something you know. Yep. We've written about multi-factor authentications and different types of authentication on cyberkach.com in case you're interested to read that. But Charles, let me ask you this. How difficult can it be then to implement MFA in an organization? So if there are multiple incidents happening and multiple different organizations don't have this implemented, is there a reason why this is happening, to your knowledge?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of organizations, like if you see some of these organizations, they're actually big names. And I don't want to believe that, they don't know the importance of MFA. I believe they know, just like we know. We are in the, in the field. We know that they know these things. So it's not like they don't know it. But one problem I see which affects all of us is that ability to fully map out your attack surface, because every login point is an attack surface into your organization, right? So ability to fully map out your attack surface, and this also takes us back to basics, right? Basics: identify all your assets. If you're able to identify all your assets, then you can have like full view of all the assets you have and the possible attack points to each of those assets. So what I've seen that is very prevalent and which we struggle with a lot is that, and this is where, it's like a cat and mouse race, right? Because we have shadow IT, we have people spinning up things within the environment that security is not even aware of. And each of these things that are being spun up connects to the infrastructure. There's user logins and there's less visibility. So it's still easier said than done. But one, properly mapping out your attack surface means that you're able to identify all the areas where, attacks can come in, and you can introduce the right measures like MFA in all these areas. So I think that for some of these, it could be what I've painted. The fact that, some of these login points may not have been properly visible to the people who would have implemented it. I'm speculating. I don't have the full details, but this is a big possibility. If you've worked in security for a while, you would understand that this happens all the time. We're trying to figure out what our attack surface is as much as possible.
And then it keeps changing because
and it keeps changing. You get. So shadow IT is one big topic. And
I know there are some tools in the market. How good they are is another question. That claim to be able to look through your environment and find out all the SaaS tools in use.
Yeah, so that's attack surface management. We have these attack surface management tools that come with as part of threat intelligence suites. And I think they do a pretty good job. There's no tool that is 100% foolproof, but part of what you can get from this kind of approach is you can do dark web monitoring. So if you do dark web monitoring of all your domain, it means that all the users of your domain, you would get notified if any user tied to your domain is found on any of the dark web forums. I believe that if passwords or credentials were stolen in 2020, they would have been in some dark web forum somewhere. And having this kind of approach is quite proactive. So you monitor your domains for compromised accounts. So when you see employees with compromised accounts, you follow up and force them to change their password. So this is a very good and proactive approach. And just like you said, Snowflake was not compromised from everything we've seen from that attack. It was targeting the Snowflake's customers and stealing their data. You know what they say about, if you can't eat an elephant, the best way is to cut it into small pieces and eat it in small in small meals. So in this case, probably couldn't penetrate Snowflakes and decided to go for the easier targets.
Yes, definitely. Snowflake was, as we saw, as Mandian found out from Google's research, Snowflake were not breached, in quote. Yeah. But we can continue and look at some other events. Quickly, let's move through this one very quickly. There was news about Lockbit being disrupted in February. It was some good news. US and European
at least some bit of good news, not just global.
Yes, a European government. Now, Lockbit is a ransomware-as-a-service that you have mentioned. Lockbit is a ransomware-as-a-service platform. At some point, they were responsible for 25% of all data leaks to ransom sites, so they were huge. And an operation was set up to just target Lockbit. That was Operation Kronos, and they made some progress, seized their infrastructure, took some of them to court. Though I know in recent months, Lockbit had claimed that they are trying to come back. But that's just to mention that was some quick good news maybe that happened. But let's look at another of the security incidents. This one we can quickly brush through as well because they're still tied to Snowflake. One of Snowflake customers is Ticketmaster, which all of us know. But this time around, the slight difference is another group, a hacker group called Shiny Hunters, had claimed to have stolen data of 560 million customers of Ticketmaster. Similar way, stolen credentials from a Ticketmaster supplier through a spear phishing attack. And they then used the credentials they found to log on and to Ticketmaster specific systems and exfiltrate data. No MFA again. And this time around, Shiny Hunters had demanded for $500,000 in ransom.
Yeah, we keep seeing the same things, come up. And there's something I want to highlight, right? So most of these credentials are stolen from info stealers. right? And these info stealers are malware on your system, on the user system. So it is easier to, steal your credentials and use it to gain access to, assets you should access. It is easier to get in that way than to try to breach those assets directly. So the attackers go for the soft spots, right? And what you notice is that a good anti-malware solution would have been able to detect the activities like this info stealers, this malware. So it still brings us back to the basics, right?
Back to basics.
That now, we call it like it was antivirus. Now we have EDRs, XDRs, which are even much more intelligent and much more powerful tools. So getting a good anti-malware solution would probably be a good investment of your resources. Definitely a good investment of your resources. Even though you're not an organization that can afford to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy sophisticated security tools, these anti-malware solutions don't cost that much. So these are basic things that every system, whether it's used within an enterprise or used for private use, should have an anti-malware solution, because that is one way that you prevent some of these yourself from being the soft spot, right? So that is very critical as well.
Thank you very much, Charles. So one more of the top incidents from this year before we then discuss generally our learnings. So CDK Global, so it's a ransomware attack, and they were hit by the Black Ransomware Group in June of this year. Now, CDK Global is a US-based software provider for the automotive industry. They provide things like CRM, finance, insurance, digital. I mean, it's just used by car dealerships for end-to-end processes. And one of you're just talking about anti-malware. One of their employees downloaded malware, encrypting files and systems, and the car dealerships that depended on CDK Global were unable to conduct business. So sales, you couldn't complete sales because they depend on them for their end-to-end process. Now, at least 15,000 car dealerships, mostly in the US, were affected. And analysts have put the general cost of this to be like $1 billion USD because lost business, everything. Yeah. And the ransom demand this time around was 50 million. At least this doesn't have to do with MFA.
Yeah.
But still back to basics, right?
Yes, it's still back to basics. The anti-malware. And another thing about basics also, I have no understanding of, how their network is set up, their infrastructure, but a basic concept of security is segmentation, creating security zones, right? So that traffic from a less secure zone goes through more scrutiny to go to a more secure zone. So creating these boundaries, so designing your architecture using these basic principles of probably segmentation as well would make it a bit more difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible. Will make it a bit more difficult for a user's laptop downloading malware, right, to be able to have lateral movement into more critical server environments that you have like bigger
to the extent of bringing down the whole platform.
Exactly. So if you have all your users' computers in a network as one security domain, so probably there could be easy lateral movement within that security domain. But to move to a more secure or higher security domain, then there should be more checks, which probably, I know that we live in an interconnected world and it's not, that easy. But also, these are some of the things that we could explore. We've talked about anti-malware, so I don't want to talk about that again. We've talked about detecting lateral movement and data exfiltration. I don't want to go back to that again, but probably one thing to learn from here is like, like basic network designs, right? So creating security domains with the proper checks at each of the perimeters, for anything crossing those.
I think a major point, thank you, a major point to make here, which I always discuss with my CISO, is some of your controls may fail. Yes. But you need to have several different controls, like the Swiss cheese model. If some fail, then others should be able to catch that attack.
I think we used to call it the layered security model.
Yes, layered security, defense in depth.
Defense in depth, where you just, but the truth is that we'll be naive, right? And I'm sure we've had a lot of experience to know that it would be naive to think that all your controls will work 100%. So now, building in, like if you follow like the NIST cybersecurity framework, for example, so you have your preventive controls, right? So first of all is to identify. The first is identify. So that's what I talked about earlier, about identifying your attack surface, your asset, identifying the risk within your environment. Then the next thing is the protect, which means that you build controls and implement controls to reduce, the risk that you identified. And the next step, which is critical, is detect. Because our controls would not work 100%. So if we have built controls to prevent, they might not hold up at certain times. So I always say this, that probably one of the things that is worse than being breached is being breached and not know it. So I think we need to invest more in detective capabilities. So that is where threat detection becomes very critical to every security strategy. A lot of security budget is spent on defense or spent on preventive measures. We want to buy the latest firewalls, zero trust architecture, everything. That's beautiful. But we also need to invest in our detective capabilities. So how do we know if something is happening in our environment that should not be happening? So that's where threat hunting comes into place. That's where threat detection comes into place, analyzing trends and being able to respond, right? Which is the next in the, NIST cybersecurity framework. So you respond and you recover. And I think the version 2.0 now has governance.
And there's a huge emphasis on on supply chain risk management. Again, which we've talked about.
Governance is so important, right? So I paint it this way. I'm like, I tell my team that governance is like like when you have a car, governance is like the brain box of the car. So from governance goes with risk and compliance most times. So being able to identify your risks, you're like the one sending the signals to every part of the car to know the right amount of, the way your injection system works. You need to have the right amount of air, the right amount of fuel, to get a good combustion. All that is managed from the brain box. So governance is very important to know what is the right amount of security. Where do we need to focus? What is the right amount of security for compliance for us to achieve our objectives? So that is an important bit as well.
Yes, definitely. It's good for you that you did point that out, Charles, how to govern your security program. But moving on then from those specific incidents we've looked at, let me just ask you, or ask both of us, because I may have some thoughts as well. Looking at everything that's happened in the past year, at least from the few examples in 2024, so to be specific, with the few examples that we've considered, the security events, what would you say are the most important learning points to take into 2025?
I think a lot of the learning points are already evident from what we've discussed. So what I would emphasize is the fundamentals are important. No matter how the threat evolves, right? The fundamentals are important to keep going. Then we've also highlighted some things like MFA. MFA, I think,
important.
It's so important these days. It's so important, especially right now that we are so interconnected and everything is online. We talked about like social engineering attacks and all that, right? So being able to improve identification is part of MFA. So you always throw a second, authentication to verify. So that goes hand in hand with the zero trust approach. So multi-factor authentication goes hand in hand with the zero trust approach. And I think that is the mindset, right? Trust but verify and have multiple layers of verification. So MFA is very important. And going back to the security basics, identifying our vulnerabilities, patching those vulnerabilities, because you see that a lot of the vulnerabilities exploited are, funny enough, may not be 0 days. Most of the vulnerabilities may not be 0 days that, okay, nobody knows about them. You get? So vulnerabilities are still being exploited from 5 years back. And, so it's good to maintain the fundamentals. And the good thing is that these fundamentals might not be too expensive to maintain. It's just keeping it to the best practices.
Yep. Definitely, I completely agree. One more I may want to touch on in the Microsoft outage. To be fair, the affected firms, they may not have been able to do much, but it just shows how supply chain risks can cripple businesses. So Microsoft is huge as a firm, and maybe they are your supplier. You may or may not be able to do much to them, but there are other suppliers that have access, logical, physical access to your environment that you may be able to do better due diligence on. Just generally improving the third-party risk management processes, procedures in the organization are a huge way to improve security posture, I would say.
Yeah, I agree totally with you. And I think we should focus on our sphere of influence rather than our sphere of concerns, because there's always those things that are concerning that you can't do anything about, and there are those things that are you can influence, right? So in this case, I agree that a lot may not have been done. I'll just paint an example of what how we approached this in one of my previous places I worked. So what we did was, for like Windows update, for example, so on all production environments, we disabled automatic updates. Now, then we had a test environment
to test the updates.
So all the operating systems we ran, we had them within the test environment. So then we were using WSUS. I don't know if WSUS is still that's Windows Server Update Services. It was in the old days. I think there are better tools now. So we're using WSUS then. So what we did was to create groups, within Active Directory to target the updates. So when every morning we had someone deploying the updates to the test environment. So all the operating systems we had in the company were in that test environment. So the person's daily task was deploy these updates, allow them to install, then go to each of these servers and do a manual check. After you do your manual check, you certify that everything is okay, no blue screen of death, no, there is a checklist of things to check. Then you raise an approval for these updates to be sent. Someone approves, then you now target those updates you tested to the production environment. So this kind of practical approach for updates, I know for security updates is a bit more tricky. So that's why I say that it's not like being judgmental. A lot of these things are in practice are much more difficult than easier said than done. But for security updates, I totally understand. Because the truth is, a lot of companies are not testing security updates. before deploying them. But I think it's something that is a good learning for us as well.
Definitely.
That is something that we need to.
I think it's an interesting conversation we're having today, or we've had today, because yes, you can't essentially put to blame the affected firms that we've talked about, but it's more or less taking learnings. Okay, what may have gone wrong? What can we do better to prevent this from happening? But final question, Charles. So we're getting into the new year, 2025. Where do you see the greatest threats emerging, and how can people better prepare to meet these threats?
I think we talked about in our last
episode
podcast. We talked about AI. I think AI-driven threats and AI-related threats should be a thing to watch out for. I believe that we're going to see an acceleration in either AI-powered, let's say AI-powered or AI-driven threats. I also feel like that is going to tie into ransomware as well. So now ransomware is interesting because of the financial motivation, to the threat actors. So I think ransomware will not be going away anytime soon. So it's something to look out for.
I completely agree. You said AI ransomware. Another thing, I may have said this a few times, but supply chain attacks again. A major concern to me. Movies that happened the other time, was it last year or 2 years ago? So many different firms being hit because one supplier that connected all of them were compromised.
And sorry to continue, back to your point, there are, like supply chain attack is really, critical. Even when we talked about MFA, they've been MFA and SSO providers who have been, targets through which supply chain attacks were targeted to their customers.
And it's interesting because then you want to question so many MFA related or lack of MFA in attack scenarios. Is the fact that some of the MFA providers are getting compromised? Is it reducing trust in the people that would typically buy MFAs? I mean, that's the question just in the air.
Yeah, I know. Like when we were going to shop for, a like MFA SSO solution for like third-party integrations and all that, it was a big question because all the ones we researched, we saw some news about them. So I think the approach is to always think of how you would protect yourself against your suppliers. So when you're integrating suppliers, always think of how do I protect myself from this supplier if this supplier were to be breached. So building that into your agreements and also into the implementation of those third-party services could help as well.
One final thing, I know we were discussing this before we started this podcast conversation, and we were talking about how it may be exhausting. Actually, you were talking about for an organization wanting to protect themselves, to just chase the trends, in quotes. And I may have mentioned that it's probably easier to follow what ISMS, for example, would tell you to do. So you understand your environment. You first of all, you want to do a risk assessment to see, these are the risks that apply to me. And then based on those risks, you are able to pick, they have this statement of applicability in ISMS. You're able to use that to find the controls that will be relevant to your environment. So, for example, if you are a business that is fully on-prem, you are not concerned about threats that are cloud security threats, for example. So that every organization has limited resources in their security team, so that you don't waste those on efforts that will stretch you beyond what you want. But that was one of the things we were discussing on Charles before we started, and I wanted to bring it in.
Yeah, so I would say focus on your risk. focus on your risk, right? So we don't have limitless resources. So within the boundaries of our limited resources, how do you prioritize what to spend on, when to spend, right? That should be driven by your understanding of the risks within your environment. So focus on understanding your risks and prioritizing your resources according to your risk. We can't mitigate everything, but we could spend to focus on the areas where we have the biggest impact, right? So, and I think that's very important.
Yes, spoken like a true global CISO. But I think that should be a wrap for the conversation today. Thank you very much, Charles. Today we've been talking about the different security incidents or events that have happened in 2024. We took our learnings from them. We didn't blame those that were affected. We just took our learnings from them.
It's not, we can't even blame, because we hope it's not us tomorrow, because we being in the industry, you know that you can't be, security is a moving target. So it's something that we keep, chasing.
And how everyone, two of us, our security colleagues, can do better in 2025.
Yeah.
We've been speaking with Charles Onochie. Charles is the Vice President and Global Vice President of Information Security and Global CISO at GAN. You have obviously experience working across different continents, so it has been very valuable to have Charles with us. Thank you very much, Charles. Any final words to our listeners?
Yeah, my final word will be back to basics.
Back to basics. Well, thank you, everyone. As you go back to security basics, thank you for listening to the Cyberkach Podcast. Please share to your network. You can subscribe as well, because the information will be valuable to several people. But thank you. My name is Kachi, your host on Cyberkach Podcast. Bye.